Chapter 1. In the autumn of 2004, an informal gathering of intellectuals in Munich served as the unlikely birthplace of a profound realization. Among the attendees was a then obscure Wall Street trader with a penchant for philosophy, soon to be celebrated globally for his theories on unpredictability. Amidst the clinking of glasses and academic pleasantries, a conversation began about the systematic errors in decision-making that plague everyone from ordinary individuals to elite executives. It became evident that the failure to think clearly, what cognitive scientists term a cognitive error, is not merely a series of random, isolated blunders. Instead, it is a systematic deviation from logic. We stumble over the exact same psychological barriers time and time again, repeating the patterns of irrationality across generations. We consistently overestimate our knowledge, allow the fear of loss to dictate our choices, and blindly adjust our behaviors to the herd. Realizing that these deeply ingrained cognitive biases are formidable barriers to prosperity and happiness, one must systematically identify and confront them, starting with perhaps the most pervasive delusion of all, our fundamental misunderstanding of success and survival. Our perception of success is heavily distorted by what is immediately visible to us. Consider the aspiring musician who looks around and sees rock stars everywhere, on magazine covers, on television screens, and headlining massive festivals. Inspired by this ubiquitous triumph, he buys a guitar, forms a band, and fully expects to make it big. What he completely fails to see is the invisible graveyard of tens of thousands of failed musicians. This burial ground is vastly larger than the stage, but journalists and the public have no interest in failures. Thus, the cemetery remains hidden. This psychological blind spot is known as the survivorship bias. Because triumph is so intensely chronicled and failure so quietly buried, we systematically overestimate our own chances of succeeding. Behind every best-selling author are hundreds of writers whose manuscripts gather dust, and behind them are thousands more who only dream of writing. When we look at the financial markets or the realm of startups, indices like the Dow Jones or corporate success stories represent only the out-and-out survivors. By ignoring the massive, silent majority of failures, we allow the illusion of probable success to dangerously distort our judgment and investments. This misunderstanding of success is compounded by another treacherous trick of the mind, confusing the selection criteria with the result. When we look at professional swimmers, we marvel at their perfect, streamlined physiques and assume that rigorous training carved their bodies. However, they do not have perfect bodies because they train extensively. Rather, they are excellent swimmers because of their inherent physical design. Their bodies are a factor for selection, not the result of their activity. This swimmer's body illusion permeates our daily lives. We see female models advertising cosmetics and falsely believe the makeup created their beauty, ignoring that they were selected for the campaign precisely because they were born attractive. We look at elite institutions like Harvard and assume their teaching makes students brilliant, failing to realize that these universities simply recruit the brightest individuals to begin with. We blindly pursue graduate degrees, convinced by statistics showing higher subsequent incomes, without recognizing that the type of people who pursue such degrees already possess the drive and ambition that lead to higher earnings. Whenever we confuse the prerequisite for a result, we fall prey to self-illusion, chasing after outcomes that are largely predetermined by selection. If the traits of success are often inherent, what role does skill actually play? The harsh truth is that we drastically overestimate the impact of individual talent, a phenomenon known as the illusion of skill. In the business world, we idolize corporate leaders and entrepreneurs, attributing their company's triumphs to their strategic brilliance. Yet, if skill were the primary driver of entrepreneurial success, we would see a vast number of serial entrepreneurs consistently launching one highly successful startup after another. Instead, they are an absolute rarity. Most founders hit the jackpot once and never replicate it. As legendary investors have observed, a good managerial record is far more a function of the specific business boat you happen to step into than how effectively you row it. In highly complex domains like corporate leadership and financial markets, chance is often the deciding factor. We routinely reward luck while praising it as skill, ignoring the fact that the underlying currents of the economy played the decisive role. This misattribution of luck as skill becomes exceptionally perilous when we experience beginner's luck. When people first engage in a game of chance, or perhaps their first foray into the stock market and experience immediate gains, they rarely walk away. Instead, they become convinced of their own exceptional intuition. During periods of economic expansion, amateur investors and novice real estate speculators make fortunes not because they possess any unique acumen, but simply because the market is on an aggressive upward trajectory. They mistake a rising tide for their own navigational genius. This initial, unearned success breeds a dangerous overconfidence. Flush with their early victories, they take on increasingly catastrophic risks, eventually facing total ruin when the probabilities inevitably normalize and the market corrects itself. Because we are so eager to find a narrative of skill and cause, we constantly judge decisions based entirely on their outcomes, rather than the quality of the decision-making process. Imagine 1 million monkeys randomly buying and selling stocks. After 20 weeks of purely coincidental market movements, one monkey will inevitably emerge as a billionaire. The media would rush to interview this success monkey, analyzing its diet and grooming habits to uncover its principles of wealth. This is the outcome bias. We look at a historical event like a surprise military attack, and in hindsight, the failure to prepare seems like a glaringly obvious mistake. We forget that at the time the available information was a chaotic sea of contradictory signals. Similarly, if a surgeon performs a highly risky operation that results in a patient's death, we instinctively rate the surgeon poorly, completely ignoring the statistical probability of the procedure. A bad result does not automatically indicate a bad decision, just as a successful outcome does not validate a foolish risk. Finally, in our desperate search for certainty amidst the unpredictable chaos of success, failure, and risk, we bow down to those who claim to have the answers. The authority bias compels us to follow the directives of experts, politicians, and pundits, even when their track records are shockingly poor. History is littered with the catastrophic failures of so-called authorities. Unprecedented financial crises routinely occur without a single warning from the elite economists employed to predict them. Yet we continue to obey them. Psychological experiments have terrifyingly demonstrated that ordinary people will administer what they believe to be lethal electric shocks simply because a man in a lab coat instructs them to. The aviation industry learned this the hard way, realizing that co-pilots were letting planes crash rather than questioning the obvious errors of their captains. Whenever an authority figure is present, our independent, critical thinking tends to shut down. We must remember that experts are just as susceptible to cognitive errors as the rest of us. And true clarity requires us to aggressively question the pedestals upon which we place them. Chapter 2. We are inherently social creatures, a reality that dictates almost every facet of our existence. Yet this profound interconnectedness is also the source of some of our most devastating irrationalities. Imagine you are attending a classical music concert. As the soloist finishes a masterful display of virtuosity, the hall is silent until one person in the audience begins to clap. Suddenly, the entire room erupts into applause, and without a second thought, you join in. Why? Afterward, you go to the coat check to retrieve your belongings. You see the people ahead of you placing a coin on a small plate, despite the fact that the coat check fee was officially included in the ticket price. What do? You instinctively leave a tip as well. This behavior is driven by social proof, sometimes referred to as the herd instinct. It operates on a simple, flawed premise. We feel we are behaving correctly when we act exactly as others do. In other words, the more people who endorse a certain idea or adopt a specific behavior, the more valid and appropriate we deem it to be. This instinct is the invisible architect of stock market bubbles, fashion crazes, and collective hysteria. In the 1950s, psychologist Solomon Asch demonstrated just how deeply peer pressure can warp common sense. In a simple experiment, a subject was shown a line on a piece of paper and asked to match its length to one of 3 other lines. When alone, the subject answered correctly almost every time. However, when placed in a room with 5 actors who intentionally gave the wrong answer, the subject would frequently answer incorrectly, conforming to the obvious error of the group just to fit in. Why do we abandon our own logic so easily? The answer lies on the ancient plains of the Serengeti. 50,000 years ago, if you were foraging with your hunter-gatherer tribe and suddenly your companions dropped their baskets and bolted, It was not the time to stand still and ponder whether the approaching shadow was a lion or merely a harmless beast. You sprinted after your friends. Those who chose to stay behind and rely on independent analysis exited the gene pool. We are the direct descendants of those who relentlessly copied the behavior of the herd. Today, however, this deeply rooted survival mechanism is largely obsolete and frequently leads us astray. When millions of people endorse a foolish idea, it does not miraculously become a brilliant one. When this herd mentality infiltrates the conference rooms of highly intelligent individuals, it morphs into a phenomenon known as groupthink. This occurs when a close-knit group of smart people makes catastrophic decisions because everyone aligns their opinions with a supposed consensus. In 1961, President John F. Kennedy and his brilliant cabinet of advisors authorized the disastrous Bay of Pigs invasion to overthrow Fidel Castro. The assumptions underpinning the plan were entirely erroneous, yet not a single advisor spoke out against it. Why? The group had cultivated an illusion of invincibility and unanimity. Nobody wanted to be the lone naysayer who shattered the team's unity, because, evolutionarily speaking, expressing reservations meant risking expulsion from the warm, safe nest of the collective. To combat groupthink, any functioning team must appoint a devil's advocate, someone whose explicit role is to question tacit assumptions and shatter the comfortable yet perilous illusion of agreement. Our participation in groups does not merely compromise our logic, it actually diminishes our physical and mental effort. In 1913, the French engineer Maximilien Ringelmann observed that 2 horses pulling a coach did not exert twice the power of a single horse. Extending his research to humans pulling a rope, he discovered that the more people added to the task, the less individual force each person applied. This is the social loafing effect. It happens whenever individual performance is masked by the group effort. We subconsciously slack off, investing only a fraction of our energy, knowing our personal deficit will go unnoticed. This diffusion of responsibility explains why teams frequently take much larger, more reckless risks than individuals would dare to take on their own. In a boardroom or a defense department, an individual easily rationalizes that they will not be the sole target of blame if a strategy fails or a disastrous action is taken. But what binds these groups together in the first place? Often, the foundations of our tribal affiliations are absurdly trivial. This is the mechanism of the in-group, out-group bias. We form fierce loyalties based on the random geography of our birth or the arbitrary selection of a sports team. In a classic experiment, psychologist Henri Tajfel split strangers into groups by tossing a coin. Instantly, the members of these newly formed, entirely random groups found each other more agreeable and superior to the members of the other group. Furthermore, we fall prey to the out-group homogeneity bias, perceiving everyone outside our tribe as being far more similar to one another than they actually are, the very psychological bedrock of prejudice and stereotyping. We champion our group's viewpoints relentlessly, creating a dangerous organizational blindness, and at the extreme, laying down our lives for the abstract concept of a nation or a flag. Once enveloped in our preferred groups, we project our own mindsets onto the rest of the world. If you prefer the music of the 1960s, you will automatically and incorrectly assume that the majority of the public shares your taste. This is the false consensus effect, the delusional belief that the broader population thinks and feels exactly as we do. When psychologist Lee Ross asked students to walk around a university campus wearing a sandwich board reading "Eat at Joe's," those who agreed estimated that the vast majority of their peers would also happily wear the sign. Conversely, those who refused believed that nearly everyone else would also find the task utterly ridiculous. Both camps imagined themselves safely in the majority. When others fail to share our worldview, we do not question our own assumptions. Instead, we hastily categorize the dissenters as abnormal, foolish, or malicious. Because our social bonds govern our minds so completely, they are easily weaponized by those who understand them, particularly through the liking bias. The more we like someone, the more inclined we are to buy from them or assist them. Master salespeople mirror our gestures and pace of speech, creating an artificial sense of similarity that translates into immediate trust. They flatter us with compliments because our social brains are defenseless against the perception that someone else favors us. Multi-level marketing empires thrive entirely upon this vulnerability, relying on the social pressure of neighborhood friendships rather than the actual quality or necessity of the product being sold. Advertising agencies ensure we only see attractive, smiling, relatable faces, knowing that our logic shuts down the moment our social affinities are triggered. Our irrational connection to others is so profoundly ingrained that it even extends to objects through the contagion bias. We are incapable of ignoring the emotional resonance we feel toward items touched or owned by certain people. A gilded wine glass plundered from Saddam Hussein's palace causes dinner guests to gag on their wine, as if the dictator's malevolence physically permeates the crystal. We hesitate to throw darts at photographs of our loved ones, acting as though a mystic force connects the printed image to the living person. This is the ultimate testament to our social nature. We are so bound to our fellow humans that we allow their mere shadows, their past choices, and their perceived consensus to dictate our reality, overriding our intellect, our autonomy, and our ability to think clearly. Now to Chapter 3. In the theatre of human existence, we are constantly forced to stand at the crossroads of choice. Our daily lives are punctuated by a relentless series of demands: to step forward or stand still, to endure on our current path or abandon it, to seize an opportunity or let it pass. Yet beneath the surface of our deliberate choices lies a labyrinth of psychological traps that distort our perception of action, inaction, and commitment. We are a species uniquely tormented by our own decisions, frequently acting when we should observe, freezing when we should intervene, and clinging desperately to dead ends simply because we have already invested our souls into them. Understanding the price we pay for these choices requires us to look closely at the invisible forces that govern our willpower, our regrets, and our reluctance to close the many doors of possibility. Consider the agony of uncertainty. When confronted with a new, ambiguous, or volatile situation, human beings experience an overwhelming, almost primal urge to do something, anything, rather than wait. This is the action bias. Imagine a goalkeeper facing a penalty kick. Statistically, the ball is driven straight down the middle of the goal roughly 1/3 of the time. The most logical strategy for the goalkeeper would often be to freeze and stand his ground. Yet, almost invariably, the goalkeeper dives dramatically to the left or the right. Why? Because diving and missing feels less agonizing and looks less embarrassing than simply standing still and watching the ball sail past. In the eyes of the crowd, the diving goalkeeper made an effort. The standing goalkeeper looks foolish. We see the same phenomenon in the financial markets, where novice investors engage in a frenzy of trading when the market is volatile, confusing hyperactivity with effective strategy. In our evolutionary past, lightning-fast reactions were essential to survival. The ancestor who paused to analyze a shadow in the brush was eaten, while the one who ran away survived. Today, however, our world rewards reflection. Yet society still praises the impulsive, decisive leader over the one who patiently waits to assess the situation. As Blaise Pascal astutely observed centuries ago, all of humanity's problems stem from man's inability to sit quietly in a room alone. Paradoxically, when the consequences of a decision are entirely clear and involve causing harm, our instincts flip in the opposite direction. Suppose you are climbing a glacier with two companions. The first slips and falls into a deep crevasse. He might survive if you radio for help, but you choose not to, and he perishes. The second companion you actively push into the ravine, killing him. Objectively, both outcomes are identical. Your companion is dead because of your choices. Yet the first scenario feels slightly less monstrous. This moral distortion is the omission bias. When faced with a choice where both action and inaction lead to cruel or negative consequences, we instinctively prefer inaction. Its results feel somewhat more anodyne to our conscience. This explains why an official at a regulatory agency might delay the approval of a life-saving drug that carries a small risk of fatal side effects. Approving the drug and causing a few deaths feels like murder, while withholding it and allowing thousands to die of their disease feels like the natural course of events. We wait for others to shoot themselves in the foot rather than taking aim ourselves, quietly convincing ourselves that doing nothing keeps our hands clean. When we do finally decide to act and commit to a course, we easily become prisoners of our own investments. Imagine sitting in a movie theater. 30 minutes in, you realize the film is utterly excruciating. The logical move is to leave and reclaim your time. Yet, a voice in your head protests, "But I already paid $30 for the ticket." This is the sunk cost fallacy. The money is already gone, whether you stay or leave. But the pain of admitting the loss forces you to endure another hour and a half of misery. We see this fallacy on massive scales, governments pouring billions into doomed military campaigns or failing supersonic jet programs simply because so much has already been spent. We stay in toxic relationships because we have invested years into them. The more time, money, energy, or love we pour into a lost cause, the stronger the urge to continue. Rational decision-making demands that we forget the non-recoverable costs incurred to date. Only the assessment of future costs and benefits should matter. But our deep-seated need for consistency and our dread of admitting defeat keep us chained to our past mistakes. This need to validate our past efforts often morphs into another delusion: effort justification. When we invest immense amounts of physical or emotional energy into achieving a goal, we subconsciously inflate the value of that achievement to justify the pain we endured. A soldier who survives a grueling, humiliating initiation rite values his new rank far more than if it had been handed to him effortlessly. We fall in love with the cheap furniture we spent hours assembling ourselves, perceiving it to be of higher quality than it actually is. We convince ourselves that the suffering was worth the prize, blinding us to the objective reality of what we have actually gained. Of course, the dread of effort is also what prevents us from acting when we truly must. We constantly delay unpleasant but necessary tasks, updating our insurance, exercising, completing tax returns, in a phenomenon known as procrastination. We recognize that these actions are beneficial, but the time lapse between the painful sowing and the joyful reaping is simply too vast for our willpower to bridge without a struggle. Willpower is like a battery. It drains as we force ourselves to exert self-control and make difficult choices. When our mental energy is depleted, we succumb to the comfort of immediate gratification, pushing the arduous tasks into the perpetually receding future. Perhaps the greatest drain on our mental energy is our relentless desire to keep every option open. In the 3rd century BC, a brilliant general led his army across a river into enemy territory and promptly ordered his own ships to be set alight. By destroying the only means of retreat, he forced his men to focus entirely on the battle ahead. Modern individuals, however, are terrified of setting fire to their ships. We suffer from an inability to close doors. We juggle different career paths, dabble in multiple hobbies, and avoid committing to relationships, fearing that choosing one path means losing the others forever. What we fail to realize is that options are never free. Maintaining a dizzying array of possibilities consumes vast amounts of mental bandwidth and prevents any profound success. A life strategy, much like a corporate strategy, requires us to calculate which doors to intentionally lock, freeing us from the paralyzing exhaustion of endless alternatives. When we refuse to close doors and leave our tasks hanging in a state of incompletion, they haunt us. Psychologists have long noted that we rarely forget uncompleted tasks. They persist in our consciousness, nagging at us like restless children. But the moment a task is finished and checked off our mental list, it is miraculously erased from our memory. This mechanism, known as the Zeigarnik effect, explains why we lie awake at night tormented by the emails we didn't send and the decisions we didn't finalize. Fortunately, research offers a remedy, simply creating a concrete, detailed plan for how and when to tackle an unfinished project is enough to silence the nagging voice in our heads. We do not necessarily need to complete the action immediately to find peace. We merely need to commit to a decisive course. Clarity of thought requires us to stop drifting in the chaotic sea of open-ended actions and paralyzing inactions, and instead take the helm with purposeful, calculated intent. Chapter 4. Prepared as requested, boss. Our minds are elegantly adapted to survive in a primal, physical landscape, but they are disastrously ill-equipped to navigate the modern world of mathematics, statistics, and probability. For the vast majority of human history, survival depended on linear, immediate calculations, estimating the distance of a fleeing antelope or the speed of an approaching predator. We never had to calculate compound interest, assess the statistical likelihood of a market crash, or determine the base probability of a rare disease. Consequently, our intuition is statistically blind. When forced to deal with numbers, risks, and probabilities, we do not act like rational calculators. Instead, we rely on emotional responses and ancient mental shortcuts that frequently lead to catastrophic misjudgments. This mathematical blindness first manifests in our total inability to grasp the concept of probability itself. Imagine you are offered a choice between two lotteries. In the first, you can win $10 million, and in the second, you can win $10,000. Which draws your attention? Almost universally, people are captivated by the sheer magnitude of the $10 million prize, completely ignoring the fact that the odds of winning it might be 1 in a billion, while the odds of winning the smaller prize might be 1 in 10. This is the neglect of probability. We react intuitively to the size of an expected event, the terrifying image of an airplane crash or the dazzling prospect of immense wealth, but we lack an intuitive feel for the likelihood of it actually happening. This flaw allows lotteries to thrive and causes us to misallocate vast resources, obsessing over spectacular but highly unlikely risks while completely ignoring the mundane, highly probable dangers that quietly threaten our daily lives. Because we struggle with abstract probabilities, we prefer vivid, concrete descriptions even when they contradict foundational statistics. Consider this description. A young man named Marcus is quiet, wears glasses, reads dense philosophical texts in his spare time, and loves classical music. Is it more likely that Marcus is a truck driver or a literature professor? Instinctively, the mind screams literature professor because the description perfectly matches our stereotype. However, this conclusion is a victim of base rate neglect. We completely ignore the fundamental statistical reality. There are hundreds of thousands of truck drivers in the country and only a tiny handful of literature professors. By sheer statistical weight, it is vastly more probable that Marcus is a truck driver who happens to enjoy Mozart. Yet, a colorful narrative easily overrides the cold, hard baseline facts in our minds. Our struggle with probability is further compounded by a desperate desire to see order and balance in a chaotic universe. If you toss a fair coin and it lands on heads 5 times in a row, what is the most likely outcome of the 6th toss? A powerful intuition tells us that tails is due. We believe that an unseen cosmic force will step in to balance the scales. This is the gambler's fallacy. We project memory and moral fairness onto purely independent, random events. A coin has no memory of its previous flips. The odds remain precisely 50-50 every single time. Yet, people lose fortunes at the roulette table betting on black simply because red has appeared too many times in a row, falsely believing that the laws of probability demand an immediate, localized correction. While we misinterpret independent events, we are almost completely blind to the terrifying power of compound exponential changes. If you fold a standard sheet of paper in half, it doubles in thickness. If you fold it in half 50 times, how thick would it be? Our linear brains guess it might be a few inches thick, or perhaps the height of a table. In reality, a sheet of paper folded 50 times would easily reach the sun. We have no intuitive grasp of exponential growth. Whether it is a virus spreading through a population, inflation eating away at savings, or compound interest building wealth over decades, we consistently underestimate how rapidly things scale when they multiply rather than simply add. Because we cannot intuitively feel exponential growth, we usually only recognize its immense impact when it is far too late to react. To cope with this mathematical complexity, we often rely on simple metrics like the average to make sense of the world. But this, too, is a dangerous illusion. Averages are useful when dealing with a normal distribution, like human height. If the tallest man in the world enters a room, the average height of the people in that room increases only marginally. But wealth, fame, and modern market dynamics follow a completely different distribution. If a multi-billionaire walks into a crowded bus, the average wealth of every person on that bus suddenly jumps to tens of millions of dollars. The average becomes entirely meaningless, violently distorted by a single extreme outlier. Basing decisions on averages in complex systems is akin to confidently crossing a river because you were told it is, on average, only 4 feet deep, while completely ignoring the fact that there is a sudden 20-foot drop in the middle. When outliers and rare events do inevitably occur, our brains immediately try to attach mystical significance to them. You think of an old friend you haven't seen in years, and suddenly the phone rings. It's them. It feels like magic, a profound telepathic connection, but this is simply a failure to understand coincidence. We ignore the millions of times we thought of someone and they did not call, or the times the phone rang and it was someone else. Given enough time and enough people, even the most astronomically unlikely combinations of events are a mathematical certainty. The improbable is not magical, it is a statistical inevitability. However, recognizing that rare events happen is not the same as being prepared for the most extreme anomalies of all, the black swan. Coined by the scholar Nassim Nicholas Taleb, a black swan is an event of colossal magnitude that is completely unpredictable based on past experience, yet changes the course of history entirely. Like the invention of the internet or a catastrophic global financial collapse. We live under the illusion that history crawls forward in predictable incremental steps. In truth, history leaps. It is driven by massive unforeseen shocks. Our refusal to accept our vulnerability to the unimaginable leaves us utterly exposed. Clear thinking requires us to humbly accept that the most consequential events in our lives and in our societies will not fit neatly into a spreadsheet, nor can they be predicted by calculating an average. They are the terrifying, magnificent unknowns that our ancient brains were never designed to see coming. Chapter 5. Boss. Human beings are deeply uncomfortable with chaos. When confronted with a vast, indifferent universe composed of random events, our minds instantly rebel. We are biologically hardwired to seek meaning, to connect disparate dots, and to weave the messy, unpredictable noise of reality into a comforting, coherent narrative. This relentless drive to find order is both our greatest survival tool and our most profound cognitive vulnerability. It begins with the simple act of looking at the world and seeing things that are not truly there, a deeply ingrained habit that continuously distorts our perception of reality. Consider what happens when you look up at a cloudy sky. You do not merely see suspended water vapor, you see ships, faces, and mythical creatures. You look at a burnt piece of toast and see a religious icon. This is the clustering illusion. Our brains are hyperactive pattern recognition machines. In our evolutionary past, assuming that a rustle in the bushes was a hungry predator rather than just the wind was a life-saving overreaction. We are the descendants of those who saw patterns everywhere. Today, however, this instinct causes us to see trends in completely random data. We study a chaotic graph of the financial markets and suddenly perceive a distinct, predictable trajectory. We flip a coin, see heads 3 times in a row, and convince ourselves that a hidden sequence has been revealed. We forcefully impose order onto a world that is fundamentally ruled by chance, refusing to accept that sometimes a coincidence is precisely that, nothing more than a random collision of independent events. Once we believe we have identified a pattern, our minds take the next perilous step. We bind these perceived patterns together into a story. We suffer immensely from story bias. Reality itself is not a narrative. It is an infinitely complex web of simultaneous, often unrelated occurrences. But the human brain cannot process raw, unvarnished reality. Instead, we strip away the contradictions, filter out the noise, and arrange the remaining pieces into a chronological tale with a clear beginning, middle, and end. The king died, and then the queen died is a sequence of facts. The king died, and then the queen died of a broken heart is a story. The latter is memorable, emotionally resonant, and entirely constructed. We force the world to make sense by omitting the jagged edges of truth whenever we are presented with a neat, compelling narrative. Whether it is the founding myth of a successful corporation or the dramatic explanation for a geopolitical conflict, we must be highly suspicious. The tighter the narrative, the more reality has been aggressively pruned to fit the frame. This pathological need for a cohesive narrative completely corrupts our understanding of the past through the insidious mechanism of hindsight bias. Often called the "I knew it all along" phenomenon, hindsight bias is one of the most pervasive illusions of the mind. Once an event has occurred, we subconsciously rewrite our memory of the circumstances leading up to it, creating a story that makes the outcome appear completely inevitable. We look back at a catastrophic economic collapse or a sudden political revolution and marvel at how obvious the warning signs were. We confidently claim that the writing was on the wall. Yet if we were to find a diary written the day before the collapse, we would read the words of someone who was completely oblivious to the impending disaster. Hindsight bias makes us believe we are far better predictors of the world than we actually are, simply because we are masters at reverse engineering a story to fit the final act. Our obsession with storytelling is so powerful that it does not merely distort our view of world events, it actively overwrites our own personal autobiographies. We like to believe our memory acts as an infallible video recorder, perfectly storing the events of our lives in a secure mental vault. In truth, memory is a highly unstable act of reconstruction. This leads to the falsification of history. Every time we recall a memory, we subtly alter it to align with our current beliefs, our present self-image, and the narrative we currently wish to project. If our political views shift from conservative to progressive over a decade, we will genuinely, falsely remember having always harbored those progressive leanings. We actively airbrush our past misjudgments and inflate our past triumphs. We are the unreliable narrators of our own lives, constantly revising the script of our past to ensure it makes perfect, flattering sense in the present. Because we understand the world almost exclusively through narratives, we are easily manipulated by the characters within them, a vulnerability known as personification. Our empathy is profoundly asymmetrical. It is triggered by individuals, not by numbers. If you read a news report stating that a famine threatens the lives of 3 million people, you might feel a fleeting sense of sorrow, but your fundamental emotional state remains unchanged. The sheer magnitude of the statistic is too abstract for the brain to process. However, if you are shown a photograph of a single starving child and told her name and her story, your heart breaks, and you immediately reach for your wallet. We are wired to respond to the tangible struggle of a specific character, rendering us virtually blind to the massive, faceless statistical realities that govern global tragedies and systemic failures. This profound susceptibility to narrative means that our judgment is entirely dependent not on what information is presented, but on how that information is delivered. This is the power of framing. A medical procedure with a 90% survival rate is embraced with relief, while the exact same procedure with a 10% mortality rate is met with absolute terror. A piece of meat labeled 99% fat-free sounds like a healthy choice. The same meat labeled 1% fat sounds like a compromise. The underlying reality is identical, but the emotional resonance shifts completely based on the linguistic frame. We react to the emotional tone of the presentation rather than evaluating the cold, objective data underneath. Ultimately, our reliance on the stories we tell ourselves is anchored by one simple magical word: because. We possess a deep, almost childlike need for explanations. In a famous psychological experiment conducted at a library copier, a researcher asked the people waiting in line if she could cut ahead. When she asked, "Excuse me, may I use the Xerox machine?" she faced considerable resistance. But when she added an entirely meaningless justification, "Excuse me, may I use the Xerox machine because I have to make copies?" nearly everyone let her through. The word "because" acts as a psychological passkey. It does not matter if the reason that follows is illogical or completely redundant. The mere presence of a justification satisfies our brain's desperate craving for cause and effect. We tolerate discomfort, accept absurd policies, and navigate the chaos of existence simply because we have been given an explanation. To think clearly is to recognize that we are trapped in these self-authored fictions and to demand evidence that extends far beyond a comforting story and a simple because. Chapter 6. Deep inside the human psyche lies a profound intolerance for helplessness. To survive the overwhelming unpredictability of reality, our brains have constructed a comforting, invisible shield, the illusion of control. We desperately want to believe we sit behind the steering wheel of our own destiny, commanding forces that are, in truth, entirely indifferent to our existence. Consider the pedestrian who aggressively pushes the crosswalk button, or the office worker who jabs the close door button in an elevator. In many modern systems, these buttons are completely disconnected from the mechanism. They are mere placebo buttons, installed solely to give us the comforting illusion of agency. In casinos, gamblers instinctively throw the dice with tremendous force when they need a high number and gently when they need a low one. We act as if our physical willpower can bend the laws of physics and probability. This delusion keeps us from falling into existential despair, but it also causes us to profoundly misjudge our actual influence over the world. Because we crave control over an uncertain future, we have created a massive, lucrative industry dedicated entirely to prophesy. We turn to economic pundits, political analysts, and financial gurus demanding to know what the next year will bring. Yet, when we objectively examine the track record of these experts, the results are devastating. In a landmark, decades-long study, the predictions of thousands of recognized experts were analyzed against the actual outcomes. The conclusion was staggering. The average expert's forecasting accuracy was barely better than that of a random guess generator. We are repeatedly subjected to the forecast illusion. Experts fail consistently to predict financial crashes, geopolitical revolutions, and technological shifts. Yet we invite them back onto our television screens the very next day. We consume their predictions not because they are accurate, but because their confident assertions momentarily soothe our anxiety about the terrifying unknown. We fall for these false prophets because we are intimately familiar with the same cognitive flaw within ourselves, the overconfidence effect. It is a fundamental law of human nature that we systematically overestimate our own knowledge and our ability to predict outcomes. If you ask people to estimate the length of a distant river or the exact number of daily flights out of a major airport and ask them to provide a range in which they feel absolutely certain the correct answer lies, they will consistently draw their ranges far too narrowly. We are stubbornly oblivious to the vast expanse of what we do not know. This overconfidence is not merely a matter of arrogance, it is a structural defect of the mind. The gap between what we actually know and what we think we know is massive, and it drives us to take catastrophic risks in business, investing, and our personal lives, fully convinced that we possess a crystal-clear map of reality. Nowhere is this unwarranted optimism more destructive than when we look toward our own futures. Every day, we fall victim to the planning fallacy. We draft ambitious daily schedules, we project corporate timelines, and we launch massive public infrastructure projects, wildly underestimating the time, costs, and risks involved. Why do grand endeavors like the Sydney Opera House or international rail systems consistently run years late and billions over budget? Because when we plan, we naturally adopt an inside view. We focus entirely on our own specific project, imagining a flawless best-case scenario where no one gets sick, no materials are delayed, and no unforeseen crises erupt. We willfully ignore the outside view, the stark historical reality that nearly every similar project in the past has faced severe delays. We plan for a frictionless utopia, rendering our schedules and budgets nothing more than documents of wishful thinking. To make matters worse, our society continuously rewards the appearance of knowledge over true understanding. There is a famous anecdote about the physicist Max Planck. After winning the Nobel Prize, he went on a lecture tour, delivering the same complex speech on quantum mechanics night after night. His chauffeur, having memorized the speech by heart, jokingly offered to deliver it at the next stop. The chauffeur gave a flawless presentation, but when a professor in the audience asked a highly technical question, the chauffeur could not answer. He merely quipped, "I am surprised someone in such an advanced city would ask such a simple question. I will let my chauffeur answer it." This illustrates a crucial distinction. There is true knowledge, earned through years of dedicated thought and grueling effort, and there is chauffeur knowledge, the hollow ability to put on a show. Many of the commentators and charismatic leaders we rely on possess only chauffeur knowledge. They speak with booming confidence, but their understanding is entirely superficial. To think clearly, we must fiercely guard our own circle of competence. If we step outside it, we become the chauffeur, masquerading as an expert while standing on a precipice of ignorance. When we vaguely sense this ignorance, our instinctive reaction is to frantically gather more data. We suffer from information bias, the delusion that more information automatically guarantees a better decision. Managers demand endless reports, and professionals order batteries of redundant tests that will not change their ultimate course of action. We confuse knowing more with knowing better. In truth, beyond a certain threshold, additional information only clutters the mind, increasing our overconfidence without improving our accuracy. The relentless pursuit of irrelevant data consumes our time and distracts us from the core principles that actually matter. We use data gathering as a psychological stalling tactic, a way to simulate productive action while avoiding the heavy burden of making a final, decisive choice. Finally, even when we do possess profound, genuine knowledge, we fail to realize how incredibly restricted it is. This is domain dependence. A brilliant chess grandmaster may be a master of strategy on the board, but a terrible strategist in business negotiations. A world-class surgeon may be catastrophically naive when investing in the stock market. We falsely assume that brilliance in one highly specialized arena seamlessly transfers to another. We elevate successful entrepreneurs to the status of philosophers, asking them for their opinions on public policy or ethics, ignoring the fact that their competence is deeply confined to their specific industry. True mastery requires the humility to accept that our expertise is confined to a tiny, isolated island, surrounded by a vast ocean of things we do not understand, cannot predict, and will never control. Chapter 7. When evaluating a physical object, a financial offer, or even a human being, our brains are virtually incapable of making an absolute, objective assessment. Instead, we rely heavily on comparisons. If you plunge your hand into a bucket of lukewarm water after holding it in freezing ice, the water feels burning hot. If you do so after holding it in a hot spring, the same water feels icy cold. This is the contrast effect. We judge a $100 leather jacket as a spectacular bargain simply because it has a crossed-out price tag of $400 next to it. We do not evaluate the jacket's inherent worth. We react entirely to the artificial drop in price. In the dating world or in social settings, we are constantly judged in contrast to those around us. This is why it is strategically unwise to go to a party with friends who look like supermodels. By sheer contrast, you will appear far less attractive than you actually are. We are entirely dependent on whatever benchmark happens to be placed in front of us. We also operate under the deeply flawed assumption that an abundance of options naturally leads to a better outcome. Modern society idolizes the sheer volume of choice, hundreds of varieties of cereal in the supermarket, thousands of potential partners on dating apps, and endless streams of entertainment. But beyond a certain threshold, an excess of options actively destroys our happiness, a phenomenon known as the paradox of choice. In a famous experiment, a supermarket displayed 24 varieties of jam on one day and only 6 varieties on another. While the larger display attracted a massive crowd of onlookers, the smaller display resulted in drastically more actual sales. When faced with too many options, the human brain experiences paralyzing decision fatigue. We become terrified of making the wrong choice, and even when we do finally select an option, we are haunted by the lingering, exhausting doubt that one of the discarded alternatives might have been better. True contentment requires us to consciously limit our options and define our criteria beforehand, rather than drowning in a sea of endless possibilities. Once we finally do make a choice and acquire an object, a strange psychological transformation takes place. The moment a physical item becomes our property, its value suddenly inflates in our minds. This is the endowment effect. If you purchase a rare bottle of wine for $50 and later learn its market value has unexpectedly risen to $500, you will likely refuse to sell it. Yet if you did not already own that exact bottle, you would never dream of spending $500 to acquire it. We demand a far higher price to give up an object than we would be willing to pay to obtain it. We fall helplessly in love with our own possessions. When selling a home or a used car, owners consistently overvalue their property, completely blind to the fact that prospective buyers do not share their deep emotional attachment to the memories housed within. This desperate clinging to our possessions is deeply rooted in our evolutionary history. In our ancestral past, a missed opportunity for a meal was unfortunate, but losing the food you already possessed could easily mean starvation. Consequently, our brains developed a severe asymmetry in how we process gains and losses. This is loss aversion. The pain of losing $100 is psychologically twice as intense as the joy of finding $100. If you want to persuade someone to take action, whether it is a patient needing to alter their lifestyle or a customer considering a product, you should never frame the argument entirely in terms of what they will gain. Frame it in terms of what they stand to lose. The primal fear of a deficit is the most powerful emotional motivator in the human arsenal. Strangely, this fierce protection of our wealth frequently vanishes under highly specific circumstances. Imagine you walk into a casino and win $1,000 in your first 10 minutes. Instead of walking away with this massive sudden gain, you confidently place the entire amount on the roulette table. You tell yourself, it's just the casino's money. This is the house money effect. We categorize wealth differently, depending entirely on its origin. We guard our hard-earned salary with intense, calculating scrutiny, but we treat sudden windfalls, a lottery prize, a casino win, an unexpected bonus, as if they were entirely disposable. We forget the fundamental rule of mathematics. Money is money. Once it is in your possession, it is yours. Treating windfall money recklessly is a dangerous psychological trap designed to separate you from your newfound wealth. Marketers, auctioneers, and salespeople are masterful at exploiting these quirks of value, particularly by weaponizing our fear of missing out. When an object or an opportunity appears rare or limited in time, our desire for it skyrockets, completely independent of its actual utility or quality. This is the scarcity error. We evaluate a plate of cookies as significantly more delicious if the jar is almost empty compared to when the jar is completely full. We desperately want what we cannot easily have. In relationships, this manifests as the Romeo and Juliet effect. External opposition or societal taboos only make a forbidden romance more intensely desirable. Our logical evaluation of an object's worth is entirely hijacked by the primal panic of a vanishing resource. This toxic combination of scarcity panic and competitive emotion culminates in one of the most destructive financial phenomena of all: the winner's curse. Consider a high-stakes auction for an antique painting, a real estate property, or corporate bidding wars. As the bidding escalates, rational calculation evaporates. Participants are no longer assessing the true, objective value of the asset. They are consumed by the emotional need to defeat the other bidders. When the gavel finally falls, the winner is almost always the person who overpaid the most. The adrenaline and thrill of the victory mask the grim, immediate reality that they have suffered a massive financial loss by paying vastly more than the item's intrinsic worth. To navigate the complex world of value, pricing, and choice, we must ruthlessly strip away the emotional context. We must ignore the heavily discounted price tag, distance ourselves from our own emotional attachments, and remember that an object's true worth never changes simply because a crowd of people is fighting over it. Chapter 8. Our cognitive resources are finite. We navigate the world believing we perceive our surroundings with the unblinking clarity of a high-definition camera, but in reality, our minds operate more like a narrow, erratic flashlight in a vast, dark room. We suffer from a profound illusion of attention. We are fiercely confident that we notice everything of importance, yet we are completely oblivious to the massive amounts of information our brains constantly filter out. In a legendary psychological experiment, subjects were asked to watch a video of people passing a basketball and count the exact number of passes. In the middle of the video, a person in a full gorilla suit walked directly through the players, thumped their chest, and slowly walked off. Astonishingly, half of the viewers never saw the gorilla. Because their attention was so intensely locked onto the ball, their visual cortex simply edited out the glaring anomaly. We see only what we focus on, leaving us dangerously vulnerable to whatever we overlook. This blindness extends powerfully to the absence of things. We are perpetual victims of the feature-positive effect. We easily notice what is present, what is loud, and what is highly visible, but we are spectacularly inept at noticing what is missing. If a corporation loudly boasts about a glowing new feature on its latest product, we are immediately impressed. We rarely pause to ask what essential underlying features were quietly removed. When we examine a financial report, we analyze the numbers presented to us, never interrogating what numbers were intentionally left out. The absence of a symptom in a patient, the lack of an error in a system, or the dog that did not bark in the night, these non-events are often the most crucial pieces of information. Yet our brains are biologically wired to ignore the quiet void and focus entirely on the visible noise. Because our attention is so easily captured by the visible, we place a wildly disproportionate weight on whatever happens to stand out the most. This is the salience effect. Imagine you are reviewing a stack of resumes for an important position. One candidate has a highly unusual, eye-catching hobby, or perhaps a minor, dramatic gap in their employment history. Your brain immediately latches onto this striking detail, allowing it to overshadow years of quiet, consistent, and highly relevant professional experience. The salient feature hijacks the entire evaluation process. We see this constantly in the media. A single, vivid story of an airplane crash or a shark attack becomes far more salient than the thousands of deaths caused by mundane heart disease, completely distorting our perception of actual statistical risk. We mistake the loudest detail for the most important one. When this salience is attached to a positive personal trait, it morphs into the halo effect. A single, highly positive attribute, most frequently physical attractiveness, radiates outward like a blinding light, preventing us from seeing a person's other characteristics objectively. We subconsciously assume that good-looking, charismatic people are also more intelligent, more trustworthy, and more competent. This single glowing trait creates a halo that masks their actual flaws or lack of qualifications. It is a terrifying reality of human nature that attractive individuals consistently receive lighter prison sentences, faster corporate promotions, and higher salaries, all because our brains lazily allow one shining feature to dictate our entire judgment of a complex human being. Our obsession with the bright and striking also drives a relentless infatuation with the new, a condition known as neomania. We live in an era that worships innovation. Every time a new gadget, a revolutionary business philosophy, or a futuristic technology is announced, we instantly assume it will completely eradicate everything that came before it. In the past, people confidently predicted that television would destroy the radio, and that the internet would eliminate paper books. Yet, both books and radio have stubbornly survived. We fundamentally misjudge the lifespan of things. The rule of thumb for non-perishable items like ideas or technologies is that the longer they have survived, the longer they are likely to continue surviving. A technology that has endured for 50 years will likely be around for another 50. Yet, blinded by the shiny and new, we continuously overinvest in fragile, unproven novelties while dismissing the robust, time-tested systems that actually sustain our world. Even the simple chronological order in which we encounter information completely dictates how we value it. If you are introduced to two people, and one is described as intelligent, envious, and stubborn, while the other is stubborn, envious, and intelligent, you will almost certainly prefer the first person. This is the primacy effect. The first trait you hear acts as an immovable psychological anchor, coloring your interpretation of everything that follows. First impressions are not merely polite formalities, they are deeply entrenched cognitive biases that are exceptionally difficult to overwrite. However, if there is a long gap of time between receiving information and making a decision, the opposite bias takes over, the recency effect. The very last thing you heard or saw becomes the most vivid in your memory. Trial lawyers know this intimately, which is why the closing argument is crafted to be so emotionally devastating. The final words spoken are the ones that echo loudest in the jury room. Ultimately, if our attention becomes too fractured, or if we simply lack the cognitive energy to sort through the shiny distractions, the first impressions, and the latest news, our brains will seize the path of least resistance. We surrender entirely to the default effect. When faced with a choice, we overwhelmingly prefer the standard, pre-selected option. Whether it is the factory settings on a new smartphone, an automatic subscription renewal, or a national policy regarding organ donation, the default option almost always wins. To overcome the immense gravity of the default, we must expend precious cognitive energy we frequently lack. To reclaim our autonomy and think clearly, we must actively force our eyes away from the dazzling, the new, and the immediate, and train ourselves to look deeply at what is missing, what is old, and what is hidden quietly in the background. Chapter 9. The human mind is a relentless engine of connection. We are fundamentally incapable of viewing two consecutive events without automatically attempting to bind them together with an invisible thread of cause and effect. When an outcome occurs, whether it is a global economic collapse or a sudden illness, our brains demand to know why. This desperate hunger for causality has propelled human civilization forward, allowing us to build societies, cure diseases, and master our environment. However, this exact same instinct frequently misfires, leading us into a dense labyrinth of logical errors where we constantly misattribute blame, falsely assign credit, and see direct relationships where none actually exist. The most common trap in this labyrinth is the confusion of correlation with causation. In a small town, a researcher might notice a fascinating statistical trend. The more firefighters that are dispatched to a blaze, the more severe the property damage tends to be. If the researcher takes this correlation at face value, the logical conclusion is absurd. The firefighters must be causing the damage. The underlying reality, of course, is that a larger fire inherently demands a larger emergency response. The severity of the fire causes the presence of the firefighters, not the other way around. This is false causality. We see this error everywhere. We notice that students who employ private tutors tend to have lower baseline grades, and we incorrectly assume the tutors are making the students less intelligent. We read studies showing that towns with high populations of storks also have high birth rates, and we playfully joke about storks bringing babies, ignoring the fact that rural areas simply have both larger families and more wildlife. Whenever we see two trends moving in parallel, we must fiercely resist the urge to instantly draw an arrow of causation between them. Our obsession with finding a cause is intimately linked to our need to find a culprit or a hero. When a corporation reports a record-breaking year of profits, the business media immediately places the CEO on the cover of their magazines, praising their brilliant leadership and visionary strategy. If that same corporation plummets into bankruptcy the following year, the media demands the CEO's immediate resignation, citing incompetence. This is the fundamental attribution error. We systematically overestimate the influence of individuals and drastically underestimate the overwhelming power of external situational factors. The CEO's success or failure is largely dictated by macroeconomic shifts, changing consumer behaviors and complex market dynamics that are far beyond any single person's control. Yet the human brain struggles to comprehend abstract economic forces. We prefer faces. We want a protagonist to cheer for and a villain to blame. We project agency onto the world, constantly interpreting complex, systemic results as the direct, intentional actions of a single human being. This desire to distill immense complexity into a single face or factor leads directly to the fallacy of the single cause. When a catastrophic event occurs, a war, a financial crisis, or a tragic accident, we scour the wreckage, looking for the one spark that ignited the powder keg. We demand a scapegoat. We write history books pointing to a single assassination as the sole cause of a world war or a single rogue trader as the reason for a bank's collapse. But reality is never that simple. Major events are the culmination of 1,000 tiny intersecting variables, a complex web of historical pressures, systemic vulnerabilities, and sheer coincidence. The belief that there is one single cause is a comforting fiction. It gives us the illusion that if we simply remove that one dangerous element, the problem will be solved forever. True understanding requires the mental endurance to accept that most outcomes are the result of a chaotic orchestra of causes, not a single soloist. Sometimes our brains draw lines of cause and effect based entirely on emotional resonance rather than logic. If you eat a bowl of unfamiliar soup and later suffer from a severe stomach flu, you will likely develop a permanent, visceral disgust for that soup. Logically, you may know the virus caused the illness, not the food, but the association bias has already taken root. Your brain permanently links the harmless trigger with the traumatic event. This bias permeates our daily lives. Ancient messengers who delivered bad news were frequently executed by kings, as the monarch's brain irrationally associated the bringer of the message with the devastating content of the message itself. Even today, CEOs and politicians instinctively avoid being in the same room as a failing project, terrified that the stain of the disaster will permanently attach to their reputation by sheer proximity. Perhaps the most insidious deception of cause and effect occurs when we intervene in a situation and mistakenly believe our actions caused a resulting change. Consider a corporate consultant brought in to save a dying department, or a doctor treating a severe bout of back pain. In many cases, if a situation is extremely bad, it has nowhere to go but up. A severe flare-up of back pain will naturally subside over time. An underperforming corporate division will eventually either collapse completely or return to a more stable baseline. This mathematical certainty is known as regression to the mean. When the consultant or the doctor intervenes right at the peak of the crisis, the inevitable natural improvement is falsely credited to their brilliant intervention. We constantly mistake the natural ebb and flow of statistics for the miraculous result of our own actions. To protect these false narratives of success and causation, we frequently and often subconsciously manipulate the evidence. One way we do this is through the intention to treat error. Imagine a study claiming that drivers who frequently speed are actually safer, citing data that shows fewer minor accidents among a group of aggressive drivers. What the data quietly omits is that the most aggressive drivers in the study were killed in fatal crashes and subsequently removed from the sample. The data only reflects the survivors. By ignoring the dropouts, the people who failed, died, or quit, the entire evaluation of cause and effect is catastrophically skewed. We evaluate the effectiveness of a rigorous diet based only on the people who successfully completed it, completely ignoring the vast majority who abandoned it because it was medically unbearable. When the manipulation of evidence becomes entirely deliberate, we cross into the territory of cherry-picking. We desperately want to prove that our chosen cause led to our desired effect, so we carefully sift through mountains of data, selecting only the few scattered statistics that support our theory and quietly burying the overwhelming evidence that contradicts it. It is the intellectual equivalent of shooting an arrow blindly into a wall, walking up to it, and carefully painting a bullseye directly around the point of impact. We declare ourselves master archers. Politicians, marketers, and even scientists frequently fall prey to this, highlighting the one successful trial while sweeping the 99 failures under the rug. To think clearly and see the world as it truly is, we must stop painting bullseyes after the fact. We must evaluate the failures, respect the immense power of random chance, and accept that the invisible threads connecting the events of our lives are far more tangled, fragile, and elusive than our desperate minds want them to be. Chapter 10. The human mind, for all its evolutionary brilliance, is a mechanism powered by a highly finite battery. We often imagine our rationality as an ever-flowing spring, available to us whenever we need to solve a problem or weigh an option. In reality, our capacity for deep analysis is easily exhausted. The act of choosing, whether it involves approving a multi-million-dollar corporate merger or simply deciding what to eat for lunch, drains our mental reserves. This is the phenomenon of decision fatigue. Psychologists have observed that parole board judges are significantly more likely to grant prisoners freedom early in the morning or immediately after a meal. As the hours tick by and their mental energy is depleted by the sheer weight of continuous evaluation, the judges instinctively default to the easiest, least risky option, denying parole and keeping the prisoner behind bars. By the end of a long day of making choices, our willpower is thoroughly depleted, leaving us vulnerable to impulsive urges, emotional outbursts, and the manipulative tactics of marketers who patiently wait for our cognitive defenses to collapse. Yet when our minds are rested and we do attempt to engage our intellect, we frequently overcompensate, falling into the paralyzing trap of overthinking. There is a fable about a centipede that was walking flawlessly until a toad asked it exactly how it coordinated all its legs. The moment the centipede stopped to analyze its own mechanics, it became hopelessly tangled and could no longer move. We do the same. When we hyper-analyze tasks that are best left to our trained intuition, such as a golf swing, a musical performance, or assessing a familiar social situation, we disrupt the seamless flow of our unconscious mind. We possess an internal off switch for conscious deliberation, but in our modern data-obsessed society, we are terrified to use it. We mistakenly believe that thinking harder and longer will always yield a superior result, completely ignoring the profound wisdom of our ingrained automatic reflexes. When we turn this intense, overactive analysis inward, we encounter one of our most convincing delusions, the introspection illusion. We sit in silence, peering into the depths of our own minds, absolutely convinced that this internal excavation will reveal our true motives and hidden desires. We believe we are objective observers of our own souls. In truth, introspection is largely a fabrication. When we search our minds for reasons why we chose a certain career, fell in love with a certain person, or bought a specific item, our brain hastily invents a plausible, flattering narrative. Because we cannot actually access the deep, subconscious machinery that drives our actions, we simply make up a story that sounds right and firmly believe it to be the absolute truth. We are strangers to ourselves, confidently walking around in masks of our own design. This manufactured self-image is aggressively guarded by the self-serving bias. When we succeed, when we ace an exam, secure a major promotion, or execute a brilliant trade, we attribute the victory entirely to our own innate talent and grueling hard work. We are the architects of our triumph. But when we fail, the narrative instantly, violently shifts. We blame a poorly worded test, a toxic corporate environment, an unpredictable economic downturn, or simply terrible luck. We claim the credit for every sunbeam and blame the universe for every storm. This bias acts as an evolutionary shock absorber, protecting our fragile egos from the crushing weight of our own incompetence. However, it also prevents us from learning. If we never truly own our failures, we are doomed to repeat them in an endless loop of self-exoneration. When we are forced to confront a reality that definitively proves our foolishness, the psychological pain is often unbearable. To soothe this friction, our minds deploy cognitive dissonance, whispering sweet little lies to bridge the gap between our high self-esteem and our low performance. In Aesop's ancient fable, the fox who cannot jump high enough to reach a cluster of grapes eventually walks away, convincing himself that the grapes were probably sour anyway. We perform this exact mental gymnastics every day. If we buy a luxury car that turns out to be a mechanical nightmare, we suddenly tell ourselves that we value the character and driving experience over reliability. We retroactively adjust our desires to match our unfortunate reality, rendering us completely blind to our own misjudgments. On a broader, societal scale, this self-deception transforms into a highly calculated tactic. Strategic misrepresentation, otherwise known as hot air, this is the art of deliberately inflating benefits and aggressively hiding costs to push a desired project forward. Academics, urban planners, and ambitious politicians routinely propose massive, unrealistic budgets and timelines, fully aware they are selling a fantasy. They know that by the time the actual bloated costs are revealed years later, the project will be too heavily entrenched to be cancelled. We reward those who promise the impossible and penalize those who present the stark, unvarnished truth, practically guaranteeing that our public and corporate lives are built on a foundation of professional deceit. To protect ourselves from this labyrinth of lies, cognitive fatigue, and emotional manipulation, we must guard the gates of our mind. The first and most vital step is recognizing the ultimate modern toxin, the news illusion. We have been conditioned to consume a relentless, daily barrage of fragmented, sensational, and terrifying information, believing it makes us informed citizens. It does not. The news is to the mind what sugar is to the body, highly addictive, instantly gratifying, and completely devoid of actual nutritional value. Reading about a distant tragedy, a celebrity scandal, or a microscopic fluctuation in the stock market does nothing to improve our personal decision-making. Instead, it fundamentally rewires our brains, destroys our attention span, and paralyzes us with chronic anxiety. True clarity demands a radical information diet. We must sever our connection to the daily noise and dedicate our preserved mental energy to reading long-form books, understanding deep historical trends, and mastering our own immediate circles of competence. Ultimately, the art of thinking clearly is not about achieving a state of robotic perfection. We are human, and our brains are messy, ancient instruments. We will never eradicate our biases entirely. The goal is much simpler, rooted in the philosophy of the via negativa, the path of subtraction. We do not need to be brilliantly insightful, relentlessly innovative, or exceptionally shrewd. We merely need to systematically identify our own stupidity and consistently avoid it. By understanding the illusions that govern our world, forgiving ourselves for our evolutionary limitations, and learning to sit quietly amidst the noise, we can carve out a rational, peaceful path through an irrational world.